Good evening. Hello, I'm Donna Harris. I am the Social Action Co-Chair for the Rochester Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We are so thrilled to be a partner with the League of Women Voters to offer this opportunity to learn about the platforms of Democratic candidates for the New York State Assembly 136th District. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated was founded 107 years ago at Howard University. We are a nonpartisan organization of college-educated women committed to public service with a primary focus on the Black community. The local chapter, chartered in 1965, serves Greater Rochester with programs that reflect a 5-point programmatic thrust, including economic development, educational development, international awareness and involvement, physical and mental health, and political awareness and involvement. We sponsor social action activities that include voter registration, education, and mobilization. We thank you for tuning in for tonight's debate. Please get out to vote. Early voting begins June 13th and June 21st. This evening, this event is being recorded and will be placed on the League of Women Voters website next week. And you can go to their website, the League of Women Voters of Rochester metro area, to look at this event again. Let me introduce you to Judith Sternberg, co-president of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester metro area.
Thank you, Donna. The League is pleased to partner with and co-sponsor tonight's candidate forum with the Rochester Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta. Like the Deltas, the League is a nonpartisan organization that does not support or oppose any political parties or candidates. We believe in informed citizenry turning out to vote and choosing best qualified candidates who represent their views is our best hope for a government that will represent the people. And thank you to every one of you who are taking the time to be an informed voter. For more information on tonight's candidates and other races in our district, please check out vote411.org. And remember, absentee ballots must be completed and postmarked by June 22nd, and school ballots must be received by June 6th. Those of you who wish to vote on Election Day on June 23rd, that takes place at your assigned polling place. And the Board of Elections will be notifying voters of any polling site changes. And now I would like to introduce tonight's moderator, Shirley Thompson. Shirley is a veteran moderator who has an extremely long resume of career and community involvements, where her mission has always been to work for social justice and make a positive difference in her community. To highlight just a few, Shirley has worked at the Center for Educational Development and helped establish the citywide Union of Parents, has been a member of the Rochester City School District Board of Education from 2000 to 2007, serving as president for 2 years, retired from the American Red Cross Rochester chapter, where she held an administrative position and earned certifications as a national diversity trainer and volunteer administrator. In recent years, Shirley has focused her energies and talents on racial equity and justice through organizations such as the Black Women's Leadership Forum, Facing Race, Embracing Equity, Take Back the Land, and Racial Equity and Justice Initiative of St. Joseph's Neighborhood Center. And now to Shirley.
Thank you very much, Judy. I appreciate that introduction. Before I introduce the candidates, I'd like to just do a little bit of housekeeping. If everyone would be kind enough to please turn their cell phones off or put them on vibrate, that would be great. Something I had to do while I was on mute. And I'm going to ask the candidates to mute their audio when they're not speaking. And as Don already mentioned, no recordings, please, because the recording of this will be on the League of Women Voters website. So, thank you to the Rochester Metropolitan Area League of Voters and the Rochester Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority for sponsoring this forum. And thank you to the candidates for the 136th Assembly District. Sarah Clark, she's on my right, but her name is on her screen, and Justin Wilcox. I'd like to just very briefly read their bios. Sarah Clark is a lifelong Rochester resident, a graduate of East High School, currently living in Maplewood, in the Maplewood area with her husband and 3 children. She's an active member of her community as a volunteer at the United Way, the Maplewood YMCA, and the Summit Credit Union, among many others. She's a longtime public servant who has spent the last 2 decades advocating at the federal level for our region while working for Senator Clinton and Senator Gillibrand in the United States Senate. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. And Justin Wilcox is here. He's on my bottom left. Justin Wilcox has been a Monroe County legislator representing most of the town of Brighton since 2012. He has been the lead on bipartisan efforts to reform child protective services following the death of 3-year-old Brooke Stagles, and to combat global climate change on a local level. The former legislative director for Senator Ted O'Brien and Assembly members Joe Morelli and Jamie Romeo. Justin is also the former Democratic Chief of Staff at the Monroe County Legislature. He holds a degree in political science from UB and is an independent roofing contractor. He and his wife Linda live in Brighton and have 2 children. The third candidate for the 136th Assembly District, Nelson Lopatin, declined participating this evening. So we are going to just quickly go over the guidelines for tonight's forum. The questions that will be asked have been prepared by the 2 sponsoring organizations, and attendees may also submit questions to this forum in the Q&A section on your screen. Your questions will be screened to avoid duplication and to ensure relevance. Each candidate will have up to, don't feel compelled to take the full time, but they'll have up to 1.5 minutes to answer a question. They'll each receive the same question, 1.5 minutes to answer. A yellow sign will be held up by Anne. There it is. When you have 15 seconds, and a red sign means that you should finish your sentence. Please. I will attempt to not interrupt you, but in the spirit of fairness, the time limits will be enforced to ensure that you have equal time. After you both respond to a question, the other candidate may have up to 1 minute to comment. Candidates will not be allowed to question one another. After the Q&A portion ends, candidates will have 2 minutes each to make a closing statement. At that time, you might want to circle back around to anything you feel you may have left hanging, but you'll have 2 minutes for a closing statement. And then we will be adjourned. And we're going to alternate the questions and the statements. So I'm going to start, C comes before W. I'm going to start with Ms. Clark and ask you for your 1 minute opening statement, please.
Sure. So again, I'm Sarah Clark. I'm a daughter of a Navy veteran and a mom who worked in the Boise School District. I went to SUNY Stony Brook. Obviously, I went to East High School and now live in Maplewood with my 3 children. My dad went on to do his own small business and taught me a lot about the value of work and doing things right and helping people. So that led me to an internship in college at then Mayor Johnson in City Hall, which I just loved more than anything. I went to college as an engineer major back when math was not popular for science or engineering, but ended up coming out without an engineering degree, but a love for public service. I worked at Hillside for 3 years as a teacher and really loved it, but my calling was public service, and got the opportunity to run Hillary Clinton's office when she won the Senate seat. And that has been just a wonderful opportunity to serve my community, to do public policy, and do the good work as a public servant to our community.
Thank you very much, Ms. Clark. Mr. Wilcox. Don't forget to unmute yourself. No, we can't hear you yet, Mr. Wilcox. Okay.
I'm muted?
Yes, now you're fine.
Okay. All right. So my name is Justin Wilcox. I believe my life and professional experience make me uniquely qualified for this office. I was born in Rochester to 2 teenage parents. My mother worked as a waitress while earning a college degree. And my father, he painted houses and also worked as a refuse collector, among other jobs, to provide ends meet. My parents worked very hard, but we often went without heat and electricity because they couldn't afford to pay the bills. And despite their best efforts, we had to move 12 times before I was 14. I'm the only candidate that's worked in Albany. I worked for 2 state senators and 2 state assembly members. I'm also the only candidate who's drafted multiple pieces of legislation that become state law, including legislation regulating insurance companies and expanding healthcare for working families. I've been a county legislator for the past 8 years, and like you said, I've worked on reforming child protective services and passed historic climate change legislation. That's why I believe my life experience and professional experience make me uniquely qualified for this office.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. You can leave yourself unmuted because the first question will come to you.
Okay.
If elected, what would be your top 3 priorities? And I neglected to say in my opening remarks, we would appreciate as much specificity as possible versus general.
In 1 minute?
No, 1.5 minutes.
So, okay. Well, I'll do my best because I'll tell you, having worked in Albany, I know these issues are incredibly complex. And I'll tell you what, we could talk for hours about each one of them. But my top 3 priorities, absolutely education and education funding, providing adequate education funding for our schools. Number 2, be working on climate change. We have to actually fund the climate change activities that we've already passed at the state level. And I think my 3rd priority would be, honestly, for upstate New York, we've got to have job creation. We've got to make sure we have good paying jobs. So those are my 3 priorities. How we would get there, that's a whole other thing. And we could certainly delve into that with any follow-up questions.
All right, thank you. Ms. Clark, the same question. If elected, what would be your top 3 priorities?
Well, I think the recovery from COVID is going to be a huge and long climb for us. I'm grateful for the federal experience because I think our state and local governments are going to be very, very dependent on federal aid to climb out of this hole and recover over the next few years. So that being said, education is definitely my number 1. We need to fix the foundation formula for all our school districts and fund at the level that that the formula should be at 100%. We need to hold the state responsible for the campaign for fiscal equity lawsuit to make sure that our city school district can climb out of its hole that's really hurting children right now. Healthcare, we need to get the Healthy New York Act passed. We need to get to a point where we're at public health care. This has been an issue I've heard about for 20 years, and it's not going away. And then the last thing is social justice. We are at a movement right now to change what our priorities are, how we resource our communities and our neighborhoods, and make sure that it works for people and that we take down structural inequities for those communities of color.
Thank you both very much. Would either of you care for a comment before we move on to the next question? Okay. Ms. Clark, if you would respond first, please. Since you both touched on education as an area that you would focus on, I'm jumping ahead to this question. What specifically would you do to ensure that children within the Rochester City School District receive access to a quality education?
Well, this is obviously a huge priority as a graduate and a resident of the city. I do think we need to make sure that our state delegation makes the city school district a priority. The funding inequities have happened for years and need to be addressed finally. We need to, again, hold the state responsible for the campaign for fiscal equity, but there's also stuff we could do right now. We need to move to community schools. We need to make sure that we're bringing in the community partners, my work at United Way and some of the nonprofits and the wraparound services. We need to take care of children and our families, and that can be done much better through community school systems that bring the neighborhood in. We need to make sure that when we're talking about students, we're also talking about their families and making sure they're getting what they need so we can break the cycle of poverty. We need to get rid of resource officers in our schools. We need to decriminalize them and stop the suspension to prison pipeline that's been damaging our schools for so long. We need to move into a more mental health, social services, get social workers into our schools, and make sure we're actually dealing with the trauma of poverty and giving our kids the tools and resources they need to be successful in life.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wilcox, same question. And let me know if you ever want me to repeat a question, please.
Yeah, could you please repeat the question? I appreciate
Yes.
it.
What specifically would you do to ensure that children within the Rochester City School District receive access to a quality education?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think, the very first thing we have to do is ensure that they have proper funding. And that's what a huge issue right now with the Rochester City School District, and frankly, multiple school districts within this county and the state. The Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, the judge ruled that New York State is not providing students with a constitutionally guaranteed sound basic education. And the reason they found that is that the schools were not funded equitably. And we have not lived up to that foundation aid formula that was a result of that lawsuit. What I would propose is that we actually fully fund our schools so that they have the resources available to them to educate the children. That would require, more than likely, us raising taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers. And that's something that we're going to have to do because we need a more progressive tax structure to educate our children so they get the money for the schools so that they can get a sound basic education, which they're guaranteed under the Constitution of the state of New York. And right now, the state of New York is failing them.
I just would like to take a moment to first go back to you, Ms. Clark, and then come back to you, Mr. Wilcox. We have been in this cycle since way before I was on the board, adequate funding. So what's going to change if you're elected? Ms. Clark.
Well, we definitely have to make it a priority. We have to have a strong state delegation that makes it a priority. When the formulas were created, the city of Rochester was in a much different position than it is in now, and the formulas have not lived up. We, compared to our sister cities in Buffalo and Syracuse, don't get as much as they do, and that's a failure that we need to fix. So we definitely need to do that. We need to make sure we have the right partners. It's one of the things that I've been able to do as Deputy State Director for Kirsten Gillibrand is have a statewide network of members in the Assembly and in the Senate who are people I already have conversations with on a regular basis. So we're gonna have to really create those strong networks, make sure we're on the radar, and we're going to have to get federal relief. I mean, the governor has already threatened to cut even more from schools if it doesn't come through. So we're gonna have real expertise to make sure that we're getting what we need in our state to make sure the cuts aren't even worse.
Thank you. Mr. Wilcox.
It's a great question. And I think you're highlighting a concern that I have that we're gonna have so much turnover this year with our state delegation, right? We're losing a lot of senior members. We're losing Assemblyman Gant, Assemblywoman Jamie Romeo is no longer in the Assembly. We're losing a number of our senators. We're losing Senator Robach, who's been in the legislature for a very long time, Senator Rich Funke. We're going to have a lot of freshman members in this delegation and from this area. So we're going to need people with experience in Albany working on this issue. And I think that's going to be critically important. Going back to your question, though, regarding what will we do differently? What we have to do differently is we actually have to fund the foundation aid fully. That is something we have not done. I think we did it 1 year only, because the state has gone from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis. And frankly, it's time that we make education a priority. And I got to tell you, I was working on this. Did my time expire?
Yes, it did.
Okay. I'll
But
be good.
jot that down, hold that thought. All right, you finished that last question, so now we will go back to you, Mr. Wilcox, with this question. 50A is a section of the New York Civil Rights Law that makes the personnel records of police officers, correction officers, and firefighters confidential. Are you in favor of repealing 50A? And please explain your stance.
Well, that's an easy one for me, because I've actually already introduced a resolution last week with my colleague in the county legislature, Ernest Flagler Mitchell, to actually repeal the 50A. So we called on the state to do that last week, and I'm honored that we've done this in the county legislature already, and I'm proud to have done that with my fellow colleague Ernest Flagler Mitchell, who was a firefighter, by the way. So this would have affected him, and this will affect his colleagues. But it's the right thing to do. There's no doubt about it. We're really one of only 12 states that don't, or I'm sorry, I apologize. We need to be like the other 12 states that actually do release these records. And that's something that's really important, because again, we cannot continue the distrust. We need to make sure records of misconduct are made available. And frankly, our law enforcement officers locally seem to support that as well. And I'm proud of them for doing that.
Ms. Clark.
So yes, I absolutely have been on record for the repeal of 50A. I do believe it's time that we did that. Transparency is a huge piece of my, it's the cornerstone of so many different things that I believe in, everything from campaign finance to gerrymandering to everything you can think of. We need to have transparency and accountability to all these processes. But I don't think the repeal of 50A is enough. There's a whole plan in front of the Senate and the Assembly right now that includes things like banning chokeholds, but those were banned in New York City when Eric Garner was killed by the police. So it's not enough to just change the tactics that the police use and the transparency piece. We have to look at what community policing really means and how do we keep a community safe that really focuses on things like equity and mental health. I've talked to police officers many times over the years, and they say we're put in very emotional situations with a lot of mental health and drug addiction and other various factors that go into the calls that they get. Well, why are we sending in police? Let's send in social workers. Let's reimagine how we police our communities, what public safety means, and when people aren't financially stable, that's when we have situations where crime goes up. We need to look at equity, living wages, and making sure that we're actually caring about our communities.
I'm sorry, I thought I was unmuted. I was asking if there are any comments before we move on.
Well, I'd like to just comment that.
1 minute, please.
Oh, 1 minute.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you.
Go ahead.
No, I have worked with folks who belong to the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and I will say this: a lot of the things that Sarah just mentioned, those are very key proposals coming out of that organization, and I think it's important that we work with our community and make sure that the police officers are trained in diversity. They understand the communities they're working in. We do need community policing. It's a huge deal. We also need additional training for the police officers. And I would say that, the Black, the law enforcement organizations that have weighed in on this have some really great suggestions, particularly Noble, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next question. I'm getting some feedback. Is anyone else? Okay, I guess we're okay. Mr. Wilcox? No, I'm sorry. Going back to Ms. Carey.
Miss-
How do you envision addressing racial equities in healthcare access, treatment, and outcomes related to the COVID-19 pandemic?
So obviously the COVID health pandemic put a huge spotlight on something we've known for years, and actually Common Ground Health had come out with a report in September that we were all just sort of diving into now in terms of public policy. This is a big issue. Poverty is a factor, but we need to get to the point. Healthcare has been an issue. Healthcare access and affordability have been an issue for 20 years. We've tried to for more than 20 years, but in the 20 years that I've been in the Senate, we've tried to tinker around the corners. We have to get to a point where we're at fully public option healthcare system, where people have access, it's fair to everyone. But you look at maternal health, if you're an African-American woman, you are more likely to die in childbirth than you are if you are a Caucasian or white woman. These are real disparities around how people are treated by doctors, whether their symptoms are treated correctly, whether they're taken seriously. I mean, there are some real structural issues here that we also have to take down and tackle head on in terms of how patients are treated in the clinical setting. But I think if we get to a public healthcare insurance system where everyone has the freedom to see a doctor, afford their prescription pills. I think we could do a lot more around preventative medicine. We can do much more around who we actually pay in terms of having more nurses and social workers be able to do check-ins and not necessarily leave it in the hands of going to a doctor or an emergency room visit.
Thank you. I do have a quick follow-up. You said the Common Ground came out with that report in September and folks are just beginning to dive into it. It's 9 months later. Do you know why that is?
Well, I think we were diving into it we were looking at it at the federal level to see different things. And I know Senator Gillibrand had already created some legislation around that with maternal health particularly. But I think COVID hit, and I think COVID exacerbated the problem. And now we're looking at the way demographics are handled. I mean, we just wrote to the CDC because they don't even take race or income levels in. So we don't really know the data of who's actually getting to go see a doctor. So those are little things that we need to do now. We're trying to get that changed. And the public health system needs support from across the board.
Thank you. Mr. Wilcox, would you like me to read that question? You're muted. You know, as standard practice, I can just repeat the question for the second.
No, that's fine. You know, so actually, aren't you guys aren't you muting me on the back end? Because I'm not muting myself. So can't you unmute me?
Judy Weinstein or Judy Sternberg? Whoever has the muting finger.
I'm unmuted now, so that's good, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so let's get to your question. I remember the question. It was an excellent question, and frankly, I do think Wade Norwood's done incredible work over at Common Ground. I will say this, you know, the social determinants of health, something I'm somewhat familiar with. Growing up in poverty and having the Anthony Jordan Health Center be that's where I received my primary care. So I know a little bit about this. And I will say, you know, the healthcare disparities are real. They're real across race, across income. And we need to do more in terms of preventive medicine. We need to do more in terms of telehealth. We need to do more in terms of wellness programs. And some of this is going to cost money. And again, what we have to look at is where is the state going to get this funding, right? Again, we can look to taxing a more progressive taxing system to tax the wealthiest New Yorkers. In addition, the HICRA surcharges that are on everyone's insurance bill, they add up to actually quite a few $1 billion in taxes that we pay. The HICRA surcharges, and I don't mean to bore you, but those are the Healthcare Reform Act.
Mr. Wilcox, I'm sorry.
I exceeded the minute, didn't I?
Yes. Well, it was a minute and a half. It's a minute and a half for your initial response. And then if you have a comment after you've both responded, it's 1 minute.
Okay.
Okay.
All
So
right.
So I encourage both of you to please jot down anything that I might be cutting you off about. All right, so now we start back with Mr. Wilcox, who is unmuted.
Do I get to respond for a minute? I just had one more comment.
Sure.
Oh, okay.
Sure,
Yes,
you can.
the social determinants of health and poverty being a factor. I mean, this also all wraps into this moment in time where we have to really look at what it means to be financially stable, to look at living wages and all those factors that work into why poverty is such a determinant of how you are, whether you are healthy, whether you get good care, whether you can afford care. So it's so much more than the health system. We really have to make sure that we're diving into all the factors that affect a family, a person, a neighbor, and a community.
Thank you. I'm going to jump around again because we have brought up the pandemic. And so I will start with you, Mr. Wilcox. How will you address the economic fallout from COVID-19?
Thank you for that question. We know that the state is already running $14 billion short in revenue due to COVID. The Monroe County is also falling short in revenue. We're going to need not only a progressive tax system, because frankly, the most we're going to get out of that by taxing billionaires is probably in the neighborhood of 12 to $13 billion. We've already exceeded that in revenue loss, right? And again, some of that's already spoken for, at least in my proposals, right? Because I attributed some of that to reforming the foundation aid formula. So I think there's no doubt we need the feds to step up, and they need to actually pass the package that's been passed by the House. And frankly, the Senate's going to need to do the same thing and pass that legislation to fund states and local governments so that they can make up for the revenue shortfalls. Because frankly, we're not going to be able to tax our way out of this. Only the federal government has the resources to be able to do this. We at the state level and the county level, we actually have to balance budgets. And so that means we're not going to be able to do this without the federal government's assistance. The federal government has the ability to effectively print money. So they don't have to actually have a balanced budget. So that's the only way, frankly, that New York State's going to be able to get out of this situation in terms of the economic fallout.
Ms. Carey mentioned earlier about the networks that she's established. So I hear what you're saying about what needs to happen at the federal level. How are you going to, at the state level, how are you going to help that happen?
Yeah, well, we're going to have to work with our partners. Again, we're going to have Senator Gillibrand, we're going to have Senator Schumer, you still used to call him Assemblyman Morelli, Congressman Morelli, and the House have already passed the package that would assist the states and local government. So we really need the Senate to step up now. And that's where we'll have to work with the senators.
Thank you. Ms. Carey, the same question?
Clark, sorry. So yes, absolutely. The federal government is going to be a big piece of how we recover. I believe in the wealth tax on the multimillionaires and billionaires too as a way to raise revenue. But I also think we can look at other things like finally passing marijuana legalization. We can use that to really recover some of our communities who were hurt most by the way it was enforced over the years. We can invest that into our inner cities and Black and brown communities that were hurt very much by the way the law was applied across the state. But that is a revenue, and that is something we can do to rebuild neighborhoods and communities. We can also reimagine what we invest in and what actually creates the wealth in our communities and our neighborhoods. And when I say wealth, I mean the right of all of us to have a living wage and to be able to afford our rent and our houses and our food and our healthcare. So we have this opportunity to reimagine what the budget looks like and make sure that it's doing the right thing to go bottom up instead of what always seems to happen, which is the money coming top down.
Any comments?
Yeah.
Oh, and I will, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ms. Clark.
Oh, I was just going to say, and obviously it'll be nice to have the relationships. We are lucky to have Senator Schumer actually as minority leader. He has been a big piece of the negotiating puzzle for the Senate and with the House as well. But also just having the access to the senator about what our community needs in New York is such a great relationship for me to have. So.
Thank you. Mr. Wilcox, you wanted to say?
I did. I wanted to say that while I agree with Sarah that, and frankly, I've said it before, by legalizing marijuana, recreational marijuana, what we'll be able to do is generate hundreds of millions of dollars of additional revenue that can be reinvested in communities. Unfortunately, the shortfall that we're talking about are tens of billions of dollars of revenue. So while I completely agree that that's a great way to reimagine revenue, we're talking about much, much larger dollars. And frankly, that's why it's so urgent that we get that money from the Senate.
Thank you. Well, that takes care of my question about legalizing marijuana and what to do with that money. So,
It's spent. We spent it.
yeah, and I know I heard Ms. Carey say that it could go toward communities hardest hit by its criminalization. Is that a position you share?
Absolutely, without a doubt.
Okay. All right. Thank you both. So now we start, just a moment, with Ms. Carey. Ms. Carey, New York State.
Clark, sorry.
I'm sorry, Ms. Clark. Have I called you Carey a couple of times now?
It's all right. I just want to,
Thank you. My apologies. Ms. Clark, New York State recently passed many election law reforms, but same-day registration and no excuse absentee balloting must be passed again by the legislature. Mm-hmm. Will you vote yes on these measures, and are there other election reforms that you support?
Yes, absolutely. I think we need to, I would vote yes. It's gotten us in the issue that we are in now, where we're rapidly trying to create an absentee ballot system with no excuse in a very short time because we haven't passed it twice. So it is very important that we do that, so we're much ready for, I think voting by mail is going to be the future, regardless of what happens with the COVID pandemic. I think we need to go further. I think we need a better job of independent redistricting. I think we need to change when people can vote to vote in primaries. I think we need to move faster into publicly financed elections. I'm very proud of the individuals and that I've taken no corporate PACs and no PAC money in my campaign. It's really been about independent coworkers and family and friends and more of just community donations. But I don't think that is always the answer. We need to get to a point where everyone has a fair share of good ideas and why they want to run, and go to publicly financed elections so that the money is out of politics. It's often the reason behind good ideas not going anywhere. So I think if we did that, we could have a much more robust system that works for everybody here in New York.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Mr. Wilcox? Someone muted him again.
Did I unmute or did I unmute it? Okay, we're good.
You're
right?
unmuted now.
Okay, fantastic. Look, I think the reforms that we passed while I was in the legislature, I'm incredibly proud of. Like many things that we've done in New York, we're far ahead of the federal government on most levels, right? We are paving the way in New York for all these things. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done to be a progressive state on just about every issue, including election law reform. So I think we've done a great job with it. I do think we need to go further. I agree with Sarah. I think there's more we could do with publicly financed campaigns. I'd like to see publicly financed campaigns. I'd also like to see same-day voter registration. And I do agree with Sarah on this as well. We've already sort of started the process via COVID, but we really need to make this a permanent process where we have no excuse absentee ballot.
All right. Any additional comments before we move on? All right. Mr. Wilcox, would you support efforts to replace the Joint Commission on Public Ethics and Legislative Ethics Commission with a new independent and effective agency? And please explain your response.
Yeah, I believe, and I don't want to speak for Sarah, but I do believe we've actually both agreed that it does need to be reformed and replaced. So that's a position I've taken. It's public that I've taken that position. Unfortunately, it's conflicted. The current composition is inherently, there are inherent conflicts of interest. So I do believe we need a more independent watchdog of state legislature. There's no doubt about it in elected officials.
Thank you. Ms. Clark?
Yes, so I also agree with it, as mentioned in our initial forms that we filled out with the League of Women Voters. We I do think it's important, like I said, transparency and accountability. Like if I could put sunshine everywhere in government, that is what I would do. Whenever I can put an independent board versus one of elected officials or appointees where they have full authority by one veto or two to stop something, I don't think that works. I don't think the people, doesn't gain the trust of the people that are in our communities and people that elect our elected representatives. We need to restore the faith in all our institutions, including the ones that make decisions on ethics, the ones that make decisions on districts, and the ones that make decisions on policy and everything. Who backs what candidates? All that information should be as public as possible to the extent that people can make informed decisions and actually feel like they can trust. That's the most important thing.
All right, thank you both. I want to just circle back for a moment because we were talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the budget, the decline in tax revenues and increases in government expenses. How will that affect any new initiatives that you support? And we'll start with Ms. Carey, please.
Again, but
Ms. Clark.
Miss Clark. It took me, 16 years to get used to Clark. So,
I've gotten 2 texts from Judy telling me it's Clark, it's not Carey.
It's totally okay.
Okay.
I mean, this is going to be the reality. The current legislator gave the governor a lot of authority to make some decisions going forward. So if the federal government does not come in with aid, I expect there will be really, really more devastating cuts to our schools. Our local governments are going to have to cut back on a lot. This federal aid is just so critical to just even stopping cuts from happening, let alone building the new economy and getting back the revenues that we've lost. So we're going to be in a very big hole if we can't. And I think the pressure has to stay on in the Senate and some of our colleagues there. So I worry about all of these things getting cut. Housing, healthcare. I just saw a study I just saw the new rates come out for our insurers. They want to increase rates at some of the highest we've had in years because of this. This is why we need to get to a public health system.
Okay.
New York Health.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I just want to repeat that, Mr. Wilcox, who's muted. The question is, how will the changes to the budget, the decrease in tax revenues and what have you, how will that affect new initiatives that you support?
Yeah, look, if we can't get the revenues from the federal government, there are going to be very few opportunities for new initiatives unless they're revenue neutral, or unless they're somehow self-funding, right? So Sarah, I think, correctly stated that this is going to have an impact across the board on just about everything. I saw it when I was in the assembly after the financial crisis. It affected just about every program we had. And frankly, it's part of the reason why we still have the problem with the foundation aid. It was right after the financial crisis that we actually stopped funding the foundation aid formula, where we had been initially attempting to fund it at 100%. So, Sarah's completely correct. It's going to affect everything. There's no doubt about it.
All right. Thank you, Ann. We will begin with Mr. Wilcox with this question. How will you work to increase the economic development for Finger Lakes region, for the Finger Lakes region here in New York, including job creation and small business supports?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And frankly, been a passion of mine for many years, economic development. And frankly, a lot of the programs that we've had in the legislature, I don't think have been well suited for upstate New York. For instance, I think the type of program that's really going to help upstate New York is a program where we actually reward small businesses with tax incentives, tax breaks, because those small businesses that have been building up for a generation or two here locally, you give them a tax break, they're going to pour that money right back in to the company. They're going to either expand the company or they're hire more workers. Too often, the tax breaks that we give are to big corporations that have no real loyalty. Frankly, we have to look at clawing back money when it ends up, they don't create the jobs that they promised. And again, nothing against big corporations, but the small businesses here in upstate New York are really what's keeping us afloat. They're the drivers of the economy. So we need to do more there, without a doubt, investing in those small businesses and make sure we're doing enough to sort of pour fuel on the fire that they've created.
And that's been an observation for a while, that small businesses really help run the economy. So why has the money been going to the large corporations? What's going to change that?
Yeah, what's going to change it is actually working with associations like the NFIB, right? Working with those folks and again, they just recently put together a package of small business program that we need to actually pass in the legislature. It's frankly about building the relationships, having the relationships with those associations, with legislative leaders, with committee chairs, with members of the Senate, and with members of the Assembly that I already have. And I have those relationships. And so, it's a matter of actually, working out how we're going to actually implement this and making it a priority. But, you have to work with your colleagues that have different priorities downstate. I have those relationships to work with those colleagues. I have the relationships with the Ways and Means Committee members. Again, which you're going to need the Ways and Means Committee buy-in to make something like that happen. And that's where those relationships really are going to matter. And frankly, I'm the only candidate that has those relationships across the board in the Assembly.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. All right. Ms. Clark.
So having spent the last 3 months helping so much of our small business community access the critical SBA programs and watching how often even the SBA programs that have been a lifesaver, the payroll protection program has been instrumental in so many things. But we're also hearing that so much of the restaurant industry might not come back. We heard that in terms of museums and arts and cultural centers, that a third of them may never reopen. Everything is at this sort of standstill of saying, how are we going to decide we want to build our community? What is important? I think our small businesses are key. My dad was one of them. That we need to streamline a lot of what they do in terms of what they have to report. And we have to make sure that our tax breaks and our tax credits are not going to the biggest corporations, but we need to invest in infrastructure, in living wages. We need to make sure that we're getting our green jobs. If we actually did the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, if we actually went through all of this and used our resources to not only commit to a green future, but committed to green jobs that can't be outsourced, can't go anywhere. But we also can do our roads and our schools. And we have to really re-examine what is meaningful in our communities, making sure that we're lifting all boats with us, not just the few that have some connections. And we have to make sure that we are really looking at the ecosystem of each community and what's important and how it should be built.
Can I
Go ahead. Just a minute. You're muted now. Just a moment.
I muted myself that time.
I thought it was you. Okay.
It was me. Okay. So you guys are doing it now. All right, good. Look, I think one of the things, as a small business owner myself, right, I have a small roofing company. I know how difficult it is to create jobs, especially in this environment. But I will say this, one of the other things we actually have to look at, and I know we don't typically view it this way, but we have to invest social capital, right? We actually have to invest in people, human capital. We haven't done enough of that, because if we invest in our people, we invest in early childhood, if we invest in, daycare, and if we invest in these programs that provide people an opportunity to actually live up to their full potential, I would say that those are the programs that are going to actually help us thrive as well. Because again, the next entrepreneur that invents something in Rochester could be that kid that right now isn't receiving early intervention because we don't have enough money to fully fund it. So I think, one of the things we need to do is make sure we're investing in people, and that there's probably no greater investment we can make.
Thank you.
I would go further. I think we also need to bring trades back into our schools. We need to understand what the jobs of the 21st century are and beyond, and make sure that we're not always reacting to the last round of good jobs and the last round of what was a growing industry. We have to be prepared for what's coming ahead of us. But I do think we could bring back vocational into our schools and make sure not everybody has to go to college. There are amazing jobs that pay a lot of money in our trades, and we can definitely do more around that in our city school district. And we need to really look at the where the resources are going. A well-resourced community can build what we need to make sure that everybody's getting a living wage. We need to look at housing and whether or not people can afford it, and people's basic rights aren't being taken care of. They lose faith, and we need to make sure that we're building it up.
We're at least halfway through now, and I thank you both for your responses so far. And I would just like to take this opportunity to challenge both of you, because many of us can talk till the cows come home about what we need to do. This needs to happen. We need to do this. And without getting into the weeds too much so that it's too complex for some of us like myself to follow, I think it would be helpful if you could speak a little more specifically, less generally, such as we ought to do this or this ought to happen, because you will be in the position to help facilitate those changes. And so as much as possible, without getting in the weeds too much, if you could speak a little more specifically about what you would do differently, or what you would do, what new things you would do to facilitate, to make happen the things you're saying need to happen. Fair enough? Okay.
Do we get more than a minute?
I remind you, you have a minute and a half, and if you have an additional comment, there's 60 more seconds after that. I know it is hard. It is hard, but
Well, it's honestly, it's impossible. But actually, who's supposed to answer the question first, just so I'm clear? Is it me
Let's
or?
see, Ms. Clark is going to be answering the question first, next. And that question is, New York State has the most complex structure of trial courts in the nation. It's a structure that critics claim is unduly cumbersome, confusing, and costly for users. Do you support Chief Judge Janet DeFiore's reform proposal that would consolidate and simplify the state's trial court structure?
Me.
Yes.
I
Ms.
do.
Clark.
This has been a long issue that we've heard at various levels of the court system that people intersect with. We've had good experiences with diversion courts for veterans and for drugs, but it's not enough. It's little, like I said, it's tinkering around with some of the bigger issues. We don't collect data across the county or across the state in any meaningful way to understand who's being held back in the system, what their race is, what their income level is. So we can't do a comparison. We can't even dive into what works. Where does diversion work? We need to simplify the system so that people can have the things like bail reform you're not punished for being poor. This system has not only been cumbersome and difficult and expensive, it's disproportionately hit certain communities harder than others and created a system that doesn't allow them to ever recover from, whether they are ultimately freed from charges or not. We end up having folks who are held because they can't afford bail, or they then have to, when they are allowed out, and serve their term, they can't get jobs because they immediately have to check that they're felons. We have to change the way we care about our people, that our system is one of restorative nature. We have to make sure we're holding criminals accountable for their actions, but we—
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Clark. Mr. Wilcox, the same question.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the question so I have it exactly?
Sure. New York State has the most complex structure of trial courts in the nation. It's a structure that critics claim is unduly cumbersome, confusing, and costly for users. Do you support Chief Judge Janet DeFiore's reform proposal that would consolidate and simplify the state's trial court structure?
Yeah. The simple answer is yes. To get into your sort of idea that we be a little bit more sophisticated in our answers, I'm going to say that, while the answer is yes, the funding is always a problem, right? I mean, every single one of us would absolutely support making the court system more efficient. And frankly, there's probably no worse or actually probably a better example of the dysfunction than family courts in New York State, in which we see the cases backlogged for months and months and months and not nearly enough judges to handle these cases. And we see tragedies occur while families are waiting to go to court, sometimes over the custody of a child. But I will say this, that family court is a perfect example of where we absolutely need reform. But again, it's going to cost us money. The money, we can raise the money, we can raise revenues. It's going to be difficult in this environment, but again, it's something we're going to have to look at long term and make a commitment. And we have to actually think about what are our priorities. Again, I think it's really important if you think about, especially family courts, you think about people going through the system, we have to invest in these families and we have to invest in the children.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox.
Can I respond too?
Please.
So yeah, when I get to Albany, I definitely think family court is a big issue. We've heard of parents and other members of families who don't admit that they have drug addiction because they're too afraid their children will be taken away. Therefore, they don't get help, and the cycle just repeats itself. This is a way that we can actually save money. We have to be bold in our entire justice system. We have to look at closing jails and prisons. We have to look at where bail reform saves us money. If we go to pretrial monitoring or a much cheaper way, there's actually ways to take money out of the system, reinvest it in a more simplified, so it won't cost money. We just need to have the leadership and the willingness to really tackle it as a full system and be ready to be bold and just sort of visionary instead of tinkering around here and there to fix tiny things.
If I might add, while it's easy to say for people that have not worked in Albany, that actually haven't worked on drafting legislation, that haven't sat down with stakeholders, it's actually much more complex than this. And while again, I think it's great to have a vision. I have visions. The thing that we need to do though is make those visions a reality. And oftentimes that takes working with people that don't necessarily look at things the exact same way you do, and compromise and actually working to achieve outcomes that are better than they were yesterday, but they don't always get us exactly where we want to go right away. Sometimes the stuff's a grind, and I know that because I've worked on reforming healthcare for years. Our system in New York is much better than most states. In fact, working on healthcare like I did with Assemblyman Morelli when he was the chair of the Insurance Committee, one of the things I can say is we actually did most of the things in New York before they were done at the federal level. Our healthcare system was the model for the ACA.
Thank you both. We are at 8 o'clock now, so we have a little more time, but we want to make sure we get the audience or the attendees' questions in. So before I move to attendees' questions, I need to ask about something that's been on the minds of people the world over. The murder of George Floyd, like that of too many other African Americans by rogue law enforcement officers, shocked the nation. What do you think New York State should do to address this problem, Mr. Wilcox?
I think I'm actually incredibly proud of the state legislature for acting so quickly. They acted almost immediately to start reforming some of the laws that probably should have been reformed a long time ago, but I'm glad that they're doing it now. Making sure that chokeholds are illegal, making sure that any type of suppression of a person's ability to breathe is illegal. I also think repeal of 50A is critical. I think the legislature is going to do that. I think they're going to do it. If they haven't done it today already, it'll be done this week. And, so we're making progress in that regard, the most obvious things, right? That's low hanging fruit. But the bigger question is, how did we get here, right? What are the structural problems we have here in New York State with respect to systemic racism? What can we do again, a systems level, and ensuring that all of our police officers are trained appropriately, and that we have diversity in our law enforcement. Those are issues I've been working on for at least a couple of years with people like Cynthia Harriet, who has actually educated me on this and told me, time and time again, there's a number of things we can do. We know what works. We just need to do them. We need to have the will. And frankly, I'm glad that New York State's starting to take the action, but there's so much more we need to do. I think the country is ready, and New York State's ready to take a closer look at systemic racism across the board, not just within law enforcement.
Thank you. I have one follow-up question before I turn to Ms. Clark. You said that training and diversifying the forces, that those are important pieces. You also asked, how did we get here? We need to figure out how we got here. How important is that for our officers to understand how our nation got here? And how might it happen?
Profoundly important, because one of the things, again, and this is why community policing is such an important part of the solution here, right? Where we actually have police officers who know the communities they're working in, who know the people. If you know the people in the community that you're policing, you're going to look at them differently, right? If you're not familiar with the community, if you don't know the person that you're pulling over, your reaction may be a little bit different. But if you know that person and you know their family, you know what school they went to, that makes a huge difference in the interaction, right? That initial interaction. And again, with respect to diversity, I think it's really important that we have a police force that looks like our community, that frankly, that kids can aspire to be law enforcement officers, and that law enforcement officers work in the city and then work at, again, I think in the sheriff's department, we need that diversity as well. And I think Todd Baxter's gone a long way to start that process, but we can do more. We need to do it faster.
Thank you. Ms. Clark, the same question. Would you like me to repeat it?
Do I get both questions?
You absolutely may. Respond to both.
Fantastic. This is obviously super dear and dear to my heart. I enjoyed marching I didn't enjoy it, but it was meaningful to march in the protests the last 2 weekends and to see the energy. But Black Lives Matter and what is happening in our police force is so much more than just the regulations that govern our police forces across the state and in our communities. It's really one of my favorite things that I saw happen when people were putting up their logos or blackening their screens in solidarity was, well, what does your board look like? What do your managers look like? And this is something I've been doing myself for years. We have been hiring diverse candidates. We actually go and help businesses understand when you have to fill in a web form, you're taking out many good qualified diverse candidates from even the pool that you're looking at. We have committed to hiring diverse folks in our office locally, not only hiring, but promoting and making them go off and lead in our country. If we don't change what our leaders look like, if we don't change what management looks like, we'll never get anywhere. At the United Way, we've been very aggressive in the Community Impact Cabinet of starting to challenge people on what does their board look like. This was something I did in when I worked at the Youth Bureau when I first came out of college, was how do we train youth to be on youth boards? How do we make sure boards are diverse so we're getting all the voices that we need? This is huge. My neighborhood had stores wrecked. The pain is real. The suffering is real. We got here purposefully. We're going to have to undo it purposefully. There is no other way this is going to happen, not by people just being nice.
Can I respond?
Well, at this point, I have to ask you to jot your thoughts down because we want to make sure that we respond to some questions from the audience. So I'm sorry if I appear to cut you off, but just a moment. Here's one question that came in. And we will start with, let's see, this would be Ms. Clark, correct?
Correct.
As a parent, my greatest concern is a future diminished by global warming, something that Mr. Wilcox has brought up. If you're elected, Ms. Clark, what will you do to address climate change?
Well, we have an aggressive plan in the state to get to renewables. We need to get there faster. I am excited to be part of it. We need to fund it. We need to hold the hearings. We need to get it moving as fast as possible on the policies that will turn our state into a leader on this. I don't think we get anywhere unless the federal level puts a price on carbon. We just can't state by state our way out of this. This has to be something that's done on a national level. And again, I've been pushing and advocating for that, and will continue to make sure that that voice is heard. Again, it's also preserving our lands, our beautiful parks, our waterways. We're looking right now at the issues along Lake Ontario and the huge amount of water that's coming in there and the destruction because of global warming to our ecosystem. But we need to be aggressive in our renewables. We need to be aggressive in our infrastructure and what we need to make sure we're ready. These are conversations I've been having for years at the federal level, but I also think we've just watched Trump roll back 10 environmental policies on clean air and clean water. And if we don't get the federal government back on track, it actually in many ways won't matter what the state happens. We have to get back into the Paris Accord. We have to be a worldwide leader. But the state can lead the way and the state can have ideas. And I am excited to bring those stakeholders together. We've been doing it for years. We can move quick on this if we have the will and the way.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. And before you respond, Mr. Wilcox, I'd like to remind the attendees online, if you have a question, please write it in the Q&A section on your screen. And Mr. Clark, would you like to Mr. Wilcox, would you like to respond? I got
Yes.
Clark right finally.
I will say this. I too have been having conversations about this for years, but the difference between us is I've actually taken action on these things, not only in the state legislature, but here locally. That's the difference. I have the experience. I actually are uniquely qualified in that regard. I've worked on these issues. I just haven't had conversations. I've actually helped pass climate legislation, historic climate legislation. It was my legislation. I passed it at the county level. And I've worked on the climate change legislation at the state level. So again, conversations are great, but I'm the only candidate in this race that's actually done something on these issues.
Thank you. This question will be directed to Mr. Wilcox first. What is your position on redirecting $10 million from the police budget to social services and support for families?
So here's what we have to do when we're looking at, again, that's probably depending on people's definition of defunding police. That is one definition, right? Taking that money and applying it differently. And I think there's a place for that because I do think most of law enforcement agencies will tell you, we weren't trained for a lot of the work that we do. So I think that is a great place to start, is taking a look at reassigning some of those revenues and putting them into other areas and actually having people who are better trained at addressing some of these issues, address these issues. You don't always need somebody responding with a gun. Not every 911 call needs someone responding with a gun. So I do support redistributing where it's appropriate. And again, that number, I don't know who came up with that number. I'd want to take a look at it like I always do. With data and numbers. Frankly, again, that's something you learn when you're in the legislature. You learn to look at the information that's coming at you because usually there's more than one side giving you data. So you have to take a look at it. So, but in principle, I agree with the concept.
Thank you. Ms. Clark.
I definitely think we have an opportunity to redefine policing in our communities. I've said it a couple different times tonight in many different ways. Again, what that number looks like and how we do it is something that we really need to lean into right now and tackle. I don't think it's just about training police officers. I think it's just so much more systemic than that. The issues that got us here are it's been 400 years of building up to this point. It's not just about training. It's not just about hiring more diverse members onto our police force. We have to really re-examine what we mean when we say public safety, what we mean when we say community policing, and where the resources go. What I think is an over-policed community is an under-resourced community. So we need to take the resources right now and make it an entire community-wide, statewide, citywide effort to decide what we mean when we say public safety, what that looks like. It's housing stability, it's food stability, it's living wages, and it's investing in our people.
Thank you both. This question came in earlier from someone, one of the attendees online, and it will be directed to you first, Ms. Clark. With the recent unrest and widespread criticism of police across the country, many candidates and current elected officials have refused or returned donations from law enforcement associations. Have you accepted any similar donations, is the question?
I have not received any money from corporations or PACs. My money has come from my friends, my family, my district, many small donations, people who believe in my message. It's why I think we need to get to publicly financed campaigns. I don't think we should be having that influence on the decisions that we make. It's really about the people that we serve and the communities we serve. That's who we should answer to, not who donates to us.
So you mentioned corporations and PACs. Would that include law enforcement associations?
I have taken none, yep.
Okay, just clarifying, thank you. Mr. Wilcox, the same question.
Yeah, I actually have accepted PAC money. I have gotten money from the Monroe County Sheriff's deputies. I think largely they were appreciative of the work that I did for the retirees, advocating for the restoration of their health care. I was frankly led the charge in the county legislature when Monroe County, county executive Cheryl Denolfo unilaterally cut the benefits of retirees. These were people, frankly, who served the community, and they had a contract, and it wasn't honored. So again, I did receive PAC money. It's something I would look at absolutely returning.
You say you would look at absolutely returning that?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see, I have another question. Mr. Wilcox, which committees would you like to be appointed to?
A great question. Here's the thing.
I wish I could take credit for it.
Well, listen, the committees that I'm familiar with and that I've done a lot of work on in the past, environmental committee would be a committee I'd love to work on. I'd love to be part of higher education committee, given how important that is to our area. I'd also like to be on the insurance and banking committees, because I believe that frankly we got to make sure that we're regulating those industries properly. When I worked for Assemblyman Joe Morelli, we passed national model legislation to hold the banks accountable after the financial crisis. So we were basically making sure that the same people on Wall Street that had devastated Main Street, that they were going to actually be held accountable. We were going to regulate the financial products here in New York State that wreaked havoc across the country. So, obviously, I would love to be on that committee to make sure that there's a watchdog there.
Thank you. Ms. Clark, committees?
I want to take my passions to Albany and turn it into the policies that work for our people and our neighbors and our community here in Rochester. We need to get healthcare fixed. We need to get to a publicly funded program. We can't tinker around with it anymore. We need to get to the New York Health Act. We need to fix education, and we need to fix the environment. But I would also look at anything that has to do with housing, the criminal justice system, and looking at what we can do to make sure that we have the data statewide so that we can make informed decisions instead of allowing each little department to do it their own way and decide to collect what they want, when they want it and how they want to report it. So I would love to work on all those ideas. I think we can be bold. I think we can be leaders. We can shake things up in Albany and maybe not do business as usual. Maybe we can really lean into our visions, and I can work with, like I said, I have a coworker who's a state senator, a former coworker. I have friends who are assembly members, people I'm in constant touch with. We have the passion to really shake things up. We have a new generation coming in there. We can make real change in Albany if we put our foot down and decide it's going to happen.
Thank you both. Ms. Clark, what, if any, measures do you support to fund and provide increased access to mental health and social workers services for students of all ages?
This is a big issue. We need to get rid of the police officers, particularly in the city school district. I just signed the petition for the city council budget that would do that. That money should be redirected to social workers and mental health in our schools, but all our school districts are going to have real issues coming back. I've talked with a bunch of different school board members over the last few weeks, and they're very nervous about what school will look like, what our students are feeling. We have to put social workers in our schools, and we have to be ready to deal with this head on. Part of it is stigma. We see it a lot in our African-American communities and our Latina and Latino communities, where the stigma of mental health means people don't get the care that they need. But again, this is always a system of access and affordability. We have to make sure people can get the services that they need, they have access to them, and they can afford them. We keep saying 95% of the people in our state are insured, but people still can't afford to use it. The high deductibles, the different co-pays that they can't afford. This is not a time to be saying, well, you can't go, or we can't help you because, or not even being able to go because you're afraid of what you're going to have to pay. So we need to do that. We need to do restorative practices is a big team in the city school district that's really giving kids tools on how to get through conflict resolution and make sure that they have what they need to deal with the trauma that is poverty. We can do this. It's really just a matter of where do we put our resources and how do we make sure people are accessing the services they need.
Thank you. Mr. Wilcox, what, if any, measures do you support to fund and provide increased access to mental health and social worker services for students of all ages?
You know, that question is probably one of the best questions that's been asked tonight, because that's an area where we clearly have not invested enough money. And what we see as a result of not investing that money early on, and again, it's really important that we invest that money early on, because what we deal with afterwards is we deal with a criminal justice system that's interacting with people with mental health issues. And that's the worst place for them to be. It's the costliest place for them to be. And it's not an appropriate place for them to be. So we absolutely need to invest more dollars into earlier intervention services and provide social workers and make sure, look, the other thing is, frankly, we're not attracting enough social workers either because we're not paying them well enough. I worked on this issue when I was in the county legislature. It was a similar issue where we defunded city school nurses because we didn't want to pay for them to be in schools anymore. And here's the problem with that. You know, that's penny wise, pound foolish, right? That we need to invest more money into these services for schools. And so, you know, whether it's nurses or counselors, we need to pay better and we need more of them in our schools, without a doubt.
Thank you. Ms. Carey mentioned that one measure she would support is restorative practices. Are there any measures that you would support?
Yeah, look, I am
in 15 seconds or less.
In 15 seconds or less, I would absolutely support restorative services. I think it's excellent work they're doing at the city school. And frankly, I think they're a model in many regards.
All right. I have another question. So maybe you haven't heard the best one yet tonight, but we'll see. Mr. Wilcox, what, if any, measures do you support to address pay inequity for women of color and disabled people?
So one of the things that we did while I was in the state legislature was we did pass pay equity, right? So we did pay equity legislation, but pay equity for women of color and pay equity. I'm sorry, you said pay equity for what other people?
Women of color and disabled people, physically.
Yeah. So
people.
So here's the thing. I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're, again, and this goes across the board, we need to address some of the systemic issues we have in society. And again, we've talked about this tonight across multiple issues, right? And the fact that there are certain groups of people in our society that, for whatever reason, there's systemic racism or systemic bias, and we need to overcome that. And I don't have an easy answer for how we get how we get there. I really don't. But I like the fact that we're talking about it. I like the fact that I just got a question about it, because we actually, as policymakers, we need to address it. We need to make sure that everybody is getting equal pay for the work that they're doing. And I want to say that that's an issue I'll take a very close look. I haven't seen a lot of data on that issue, to be honest with you, but it's one, again, because it's sort of a novel question that you've asked me. It's something I want to take a serious look at. And frankly, that's one of those issues that might move to the top of my list.
Thank you. Ms. Clark.
Well, this is one of, obviously, as someone who goes to Women's Pay Day in April, when we finally get to the point where our pay is equal in a year, or from the previous year. This is really important. This is about dignity of people. In the disabled community, we need to get rid of sheltered in place and paying well below minimum wage for work that is done by many in the disabled community. We need to make sure we're an accessible community. But our women of color, our Latina and Latino African-American women are so important, and nothing changes unless we hire them, promote them, and make them leaders. This is what I've been doing. I have watched it. I've done it multiple times in my own office. They're the change makers that are going to help drive this conversation. We can legislate, but if people aren't hiring and people are, we've already seen studies that if there aren't at least 51% of women in the room, then people don't change. There's still often a male tilt to the conversation that doesn't really see the voices of women as equal. It's why we need women in our state representation. Right now, we have no women in our state delegation. And other than Assemblywoman Romeo serving for her year, we haven't had a woman in 10 years in our state delegation. It's why voices matter. It's why we need to make sure that the people at the table are from diverse backgrounds, represent different communities, and therefore we'll actually affect change, not just through policy and not just through legislation.
Can I add to that question? Or are we not doing responses in this segment?
Only because we're moving to closing statements.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And at this time, since Ms. Clark made the first opening statement, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Wilcox, to take up to 2 minutes to make your closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I want to actually take this opportunity to sort of address a couple of the questions and sort of point out some things that I've done as a legislator that I just wanted to make sure that, frankly, the folks that are listening to this are aware of, because I didn't have a chance to answer a couple of questions of what I would do. Again, a lot of what you've asked us tonight is what would you do? Well, again, over and over, you can go to my website, you can look at what I've done, not what I've said I'll do, but what I've done. And on the issue of, policing and issues of race and policing, we passed in Monroe County an unconstitutional police harassment law. And I don't know if people who are listening are familiar with that, but it was where basically you weren't allowed to annoy a police officer. And I stood up on the floor and I led the fight against that bill because I knew it was unconstitutional. And the law department couldn't answer the question on exactly what acts were prohibited under the law, which is the test you need to pass in order for a law to be constitutional. It needs to be understood what activities are prohibited. They couldn't answer the question. The sponsor of the bill couldn't answer the question. And unfortunately, these are my closing remarks. I guess I'm not going to be able to get to the other part of this because it does come back around when our public defender hired the people responsible for that law. Our public defender hired the people responsible for that law. I said it again twice because it's hard to believe. All white and frankly, all Republicans, again, I have nothing against the Republicans per se, but here's the thing. They were responsible for passing an unconstitutional harassment law that they knew was unconstitutional for political reasons, and the public defender had the audacity to hire them. I stood up and I called them out on that, as did my colleague Vince Felder and Ernest Flagler Mitchell and Sabrina Lamar. Called them out, and we know what we got? We got a diversity officer out of that. Those people were no longer hired, and we got a diversity officer instead. And that's, again, me not talking about an issue, but acting on it.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. And now, Ms. Clark, you have About 2 minutes and 15, 20 seconds, maybe.
Thank you. So for me, public service is about public service. I love working with people in our communities and have been doing it for 20 years. The last 3 months, I have been coordinating getting food to people who can't get it. I've been helping small businesses who are about to close their doors. I've been giving them the real resources that they need to get through in a day. We had a constituent call who was suicidal, and we, within a day, had made sure she was okay. She was taking care of her elder parents. It's those people that I think of. It's the voice of a mom of 3 young children that I am, and bringing that to Albany as I think about all the single moms right now who couldn't pay their rent and are calling me in tears. That's who I think of every day when I go to work. I've done 50 grant workshops. I've brought in White House aides on the Council on Aging to listen directly to our seniors to inform policy at the White House level. We can have a bold vision of bringing government to people, working with our communities, and making sure it's connected. It's about having a different vision, a different background, and bringing that voice that I represent to the table. I think it's really important to understand like how we got here, what we need to do to systematically dismantle it, and the future we really envision for our children and the next generation. It's the environment, it's living wages, it's what our communities and neighborhoods look like. Do we make sure we take care of the basic needs of our neighbors and their families? That's who I think of every day when I go to work. We have had, you listen to the community and they want trail funding, not road funding. Well, then you advocate to make sure that transportation funding changes. That's what we do. We want to preserve our Finger Lakes region, including all the way to Monroe County. So we get the National Park Service. We pass in Congress a bill to get the National Park Service to study that. We can do it in Congress, of all places, to pass the bill right now. That is one of the hard places, but we did it. So we have to envision our future. We have to decide whether we want different, bold voices and a vision that isn't the same as it's been before. Take my experience, the constituents that I've been working with. I'm on a child care task force right now to rebuild our nonprofits world. I am part of all these systems already that are trying to recover from COVID. And I want to take that up. Yes, you are welcome.
I'd like to thank you both, Ms. Clark, for your graciousness in me flubbing your name so many times. Thank you. And Mr. Wilcox, your patience with the time constraints. But I hope this has been an informative evening for our listeners. We know that we have appreciated very much the time you've spent with us, candidates. So I will just remind our listeners that we need for you to go to the polls. You can do early voting between June 13th and June 21st at any early voting site in Monroe County. And if you go on voting day, June 23rd, then you need to go to your assigned polling site. So we ask you to get out and vote. And I thank very much my timekeeper and Carmody. You're phenomenal. And again, thank you to the Deltas and the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this forum tonight.
Thank you. It's so important. We thank you for your time. This is not easy in our new virtual world, so.
Thank you for all you do to promote fair, free, and open elections. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.